Julius Neubronner inherited his father's apothecary shop in Kronberg, a Bavarian town 12 kilometers northwest of Frankfurt, in 1898. The pharmacy thrived, but Neubronner's real passion occupied the loft above the dispensary, a workshop crammed with lenses, chemical baths, and wooden boxes housing 300 homing pigeons. He'd been using the birds for pharmaceutical deliveries since 1888, strapping tiny metal canisters to their backs for urgent morphine and digitalis shipments to distant sanatoriums. The system worked flawlessly until 1903, when a pigeon named Kaiser vanished for 4 weeks, then returned well-fed and healthy. Neubronner became obsessed with a single question: where had Kaiser been? The obvious answer, attach a camera, seemed absurd. In 1903, the smallest commercially available cameras weighed over 500 grams. Kodak's Brownie, considered revolutionary for its portability, still massed 450 grams without film. A carrier pigeon could manage 75 grams maximum before flight performance degraded. Neubronner needed to shrink photography equipment by 85% while maintaining every function: a lens, shutter, film advance, and most critically, an automatic trigger the pigeon couldn't accidentally activate mid-flight. He spent 18 months in that loft, machining components by hand. His first prototype weighed 140 grams, a failure. The second used thinner aluminum sheeting, but the shutter mechanism jammed. By late 1904, Neubronner had burned through his pharmacy profits and filled 3 notebooks with crossed-out mechanical diagrams. His wife Maria begged him to abandon the project. Local camera clubs dismissed it as impossible. One Munich photographer calculated that any lens small enough would lack sufficient light-gathering capacity for aerial exposures. The mathematics simply didn't work. Neubronner proved him wrong on November 18, 1904. His third prototype, weighing 72 grams, produced a single blurry photograph of his pharmacy roof from 40 meters altitude. The image quality was terrible, barely discernible tiles and chimney stacks, but it existed. He'd solved the weight problem through radical material reduction. A curved aluminum body just 0.4 millimeters thick, a single-element lens ground from crown glass, and celluloid film plates measuring 4 centimeters instead of the standard 9/12. The automatic trigger used compressed air stored in a miniature brass cylinder, a pneumatic timer that released the shutter 30 seconds after the pigeon launched, ensuring stable flight altitude. The breakthrough came at a cost. Neubronner's hands bore permanent scars from metalworking accidents. He'd converted his entire loft into a camera workshop, forcing the pigeons into smaller coops. Maria had stopped asking when he'd returned to focusing on pharmacy customers. But on that November morning, holding that first fuzzy aerial photograph under his magnifying loupe, Neubronner knew he'd created something unprecedented. No human had ever captured the Earth from a bird's perspective using automated equipment. The technical obstacles that made experts dismiss the project, weight constraints, automatic triggering, stable image capture during flight, had all been conquered through obsessive iteration. He submitted his first patent application to the Imperial Patent Office in Berlin 3 weeks later. They rejected it in January 1905 with a terse dismissal: insufficient evidence of practical function. Neubronner filed again in May 1906 with improved photographs. Second rejection. The patent examiners didn't believe a pigeon could carry a functional camera. They demanded a public demonstration. The engineering challenge wasn't just miniaturization. It was creating a complete photographic system that could survive the chaos of pigeon flight. A bird in motion experiences constant vibration, sudden altitude changes, and unpredictable banking maneuvers. Neubronner needed a camera that could handle 3 to 4 G-forces during takeoff, maintain lens alignment during 80 km/h flight speeds, and trigger automatically without any input from an animal whose brain weighed 1.2 grams. Weight distribution presented the first nightmare. A pigeon's center of gravity sits directly between its wings. Any asymmetrical load causes spiral flight patterns and exhaustion within minutes. Neubronner's camera had to mount on the bird's chest in perfect balance, which meant the aluminum housing couldn't be rectangular. It needed to curve with the pigeon's sternum. He spent 6 months teaching himself metalworking techniques normally used for pocket watch cases, hammering thin aluminum sheets over wooden forms until they matched the exact contour of his pigeons' bodies. Each housing required 40 hours of hand finishing. A single misaligned rivet would shift the center of gravity by millimeters and ruin flight stability. The shutter mechanism defied conventional camera design. Standard shutters used springs or rubber bands for tension, but both materials added weight and required manual cocking before each exposure. Neubronner's solution, the compressed air timer, was mechanically brilliant and absurdly fragile. He machined a brass cylinder 15 millimeters long and 6 millimeters in diameter, filled it with air compressed to 3 atmospheres using a modified bicycle pump, then connected it to a needle valve and pneumatic piston. When the Pigeon launched, Neubronner would pull a small pin-releasing airflow through the valve. The escaping air slowly pushed the piston over 30 seconds, eventually tripping a mechanical linkage that opened the shutter for 1/100th of a second. The entire sequence happened automatically at altitude, when the Pigeon had stabilized into level flight, but compressed air leaked. The brass seals Neubronner could machine by hand in 1905 weren't precise enough to hold pressure for more than 2 hours. If a Pigeon took longer to reach its destination, the timer would fail or trigger prematurely. He experimented with leather gaskets, cork seals, and rubber O-rings before discovering that beeswax mixed with graphite powder created an effective temporary seal. Each camera could only be loaded and pressurized 30 minutes before flight, a constraint that would later frustrate military planners. Lens design presented a different problem entirely. Neubronner needed a focal length of 40 millimeters to capture useful ground detail from 50-100 meters altitude. But miniature lenses with that focal length suffered from severe chromatic aberration, colored halos around every object that rendered images useless. Professional lens grinders in Wetzlar told him correction required multiple glass elements, which would triple the weight. Neubronner solved it by abandoning color accuracy entirely. He ground a single-element lens from dense crown glass, then paired it with orthochromatic film plates sensitive only to blue and green wavelengths. The aberration still existed, but the film couldn't register it. His aerial photographs emerged in high-contrast black and white, with reds appearing nearly black, but they were sharp. By early 1907, Neubronner had a functioning camera weighing 71 grams that produced recognizable aerial photographs. He'd spent 4,200 marks, equivalent to half a year's pharmacy income, and accumulated a workshop full of failed prototypes. The Imperial Patent Office still refused to grant his patent without public proof. Photography experts continued publishing technical papers explaining why pigeon-mounted cameras were physically impossible. The curved aluminum housing measured 5.2 centimeters across at its widest point and 3.8 centimeters deep. Dimensions Neubronner arrived at through brutal trial and error. Anything larger disrupted the Pigeon's wing stroke. Anything smaller couldn't accommodate the film plate and lens assembly. He fabricated each body from commercial-grade aluminum sheet stock, 0.4 millimeters thick, purchased from a Munich metalworking supplier for 2.50 marks per square meter. The material had to be thin enough to hand-form but thick enough to protect the glass lens and film from impact when pigeons landed on rooftops. Shaping the housing required a technique Neubronner adapted from instrument makers. He carved wooden mandrels matching the chest profile of his largest pigeons, birds weighing 380-420 grams that could handle the payload. He'd anneal the aluminum over his kitchen stove until it glowed dull red, then immediately hammer it over the mandrel while the metal remained soft. The curved body took shape through 200-300 careful strikes. Overheating caused brittleness. Insufficient heating meant the aluminum cracked during forming. Neubronner destroyed 17 bodies before developing the muscle memory to judge correct annealing temperature by color alone. The pneumatic timer consumed his attention for 8 months. The brass cylinder measured 15 millimeters long with a 6 millimeter bore, machined on a jeweler's lathe Neubronner purchased second-hand for 85 marks. He drilled the bore to within 0.05 millimeters of tolerance. Anything looser and air pressure leaked too quickly. Anything tighter and the piston binding caused erratic timing. The piston itself weighed 0.8 grams, turned from brass rod and polished until it moved freely with only air pressure as motivation. A needle valve controlled release rate. 0.4 millimeter orifice diameter produced a 30-second delay. 0.5 millimeters gave 25 seconds. 0.3 millimeters stretched to 38 seconds. Neubronner calibrated each valve by hand, testing release times with a stopwatch and adjusting the orifice with progressively finer drill bits. The triggering linkage connected pneumatic pressure to shutter operation through an elegant mechanical sequence. As the piston extended, it pushed a brass lever that rotated a cam wheel, which released a spring-loaded blade shutter. The shutter itself, 2 brass leaves 8 millimeters square, opened and closed in approximately 1/100th of a second. Controlled by spring tension, Neubronner calibrated using a makeshift tachometer built from pocket watch parts. Faster shutter speeds would freeze pigeon motion better, but required stronger springs, adding weight. Slower speeds risked motion blur. He settled on 1/100th after discovering that pigeons maintained remarkably stable flight during their cruising phase, with vibration frequencies around 12 Hz that didn't significantly degrade image quality at that exposure duration. Glass plates presented the final challenge. Standard photographic plates measured 9 12 centimeters and weighed 15 grams each. Neubronner commissioned a Dresden glass works to produce custom 4 centimeter plates, just 1.2 millimeters thick, that weighed 3.8 grams including the light-sensitive emulsion. He coated them himself using a silver bromide emulsion formula he'd modified for high contrast, working in his pharmacy's darkroom after hours. Each plate could capture approximately 16 square meters of ground area from 50 meters altitude, enough to photograph a city block. The complete camera system, fully loaded with pressurized air cylinder, glass plate, and mounting harness, weighed 71 grams. Neubronner's pigeons could fly 30 kilometers with that payload and return within 45 minutes. He'd transformed an impossible concept into precision machinery built in a provincial pharmacy loft, using nothing more expensive than a jeweler's lathe and exceptional patience. The Imperial Patent Office in Berlin rejected Neubronner's application for the 3rd time on March 22, 1907. The official response, signed by examining officer Hermann Volker, stated that the device lacks sufficient evidence of practical utility and appears to contradict established principles of avian physiology. Volker's report cited calculations from the Prussian Ornithological Society showing that carrier pigeons experience 15 to 20% reduction in flight range for every 50 grams of payload. A 71-gram camera would, according to their mathematics, render pigeons incapable of sustained flight beyond 10 kilometers. The rejection letter concluded with thinly veiled condescension. The applicant is encouraged to pursue photographic innovations within physically plausible parameters. Neubronner's response arrived 6 weeks later in the form of 23 aerial photographs, each stamped with flight data. Image number 7 showed Frankfurt's Römerberg Square from 73 meters altitude, captured by a pigeon that had flown 18 kilometers from Kronberg. Image number 14 depicted the main river bridges from 58 meters, a 22-kilometer flight. Image number 19, the photograph that finally silenced critics, showed the Imperial Patent Office's own building on Gitchener Strasse, photographed from 61 meters by a pigeon. Neubronner had released 15 kilometers away in Tempelhof. He included detailed flight logs, launch times, return times, payload weights, and altitude estimates calculated from the ground scale visible in each image. the patent office remained unmoved. They granted patent number 195,247 on December 2, 1908, but only after Neubronner agreed to public demonstrations before a technical review board. The skepticism ran deeper than bureaucratic caution. Camera manufacturers in Dresden and Wetzlar had spent decades perfecting photographic equipment, investing fortunes in precision optics and mechanical engineering. The idea that a provincial pharmacist could miniaturize their technology using hand tools and workshop empiricism offended professional sensibilities. The German Photography Society published a particularly harsh critique in their January 1908 journal. Professor Ernst Abbe, director of the Zeiss Optical Works, wrote that Neubronner's single-element lens design violates fundamental optical principles and predicted the images would be hopelessly degraded by uncorrected aberrations. The article included optical diagrams proving that acceptable image quality required at minimum a 3-element lens system, which would weigh over 100 grams in the necessary focal length. Abbe never mentioned that he hadn't actually examined Neubronner's photographs. Ornithological societies proved equally dismissive. Dr. Heinrich Reichenau, director of Berlin Zoological Museum, published calculations in Journal für Ornithologie, demonstrating that a 71-gram chest-mounted payload would increase a pigeon's wing loading from 0.43 to 0.58 grams per square centimeter, beyond the species' sustainable flight threshold. Reichenau's numbers were mathematically sound, but ignored actual flight testing. Neubronner's pigeons, conditioned over months to carry increasing weights, had adapted their flight mechanics to compensate. They flew with steeper takeoff angles, maintained higher wing beat frequencies, and selected optimal altitudes where air density provided better lift. Biology had adjusted to meet engineering requirements. The accusations of fraud emerged in spring 1908. Anonymous letters to Frankfurt newspapers claimed Neubronner's aerial photographs were actually captured from church towers and building roofs using conventional cameras, then falsely attributed to pigeon flight. One letter, published in the Frankfurter Zeitung on April 17, 1908, offered a 500-mark reward to anyone who could witness a successful pigeon camera flight. Neubronner accepted immediately, proposing a demonstration at the upcoming International Photographic Exhibition in Dresden. The letter writer never claimed his reward and never revealed his identity. The International Photographic Exhibition opened in Dresden's Glass Palace on May 1, 1909, drawing 12,000 visitors during its first week. Neubronner's demonstration occupied a specially constructed area in the exhibition's east wing, a 40-square-meter space containing his traveling pigeon loft, camera preparation table, and enlargement equipment for immediate print development. The Dresden Organizing Committee had initially rejected his application, relenting only after Neubronner offered to perform live flights with same-day photographic results. They scheduled his demonstrations for 10 a.m. daily, positioned strategically near the main entrance where failures would be maximally visible. May 4, 1909, became the day skepticism died. Neubronner arrived at 8:30 a.m. with 5 pigeons, each fitted with a prepared camera. Weather conditions were acceptable: light winds from the southwest, scattered clouds at 200 meters, temperature 14 degrees Celsius. At 9:45 a.m., with approximately 300 spectators gathered, he opened the first carrying cage. The pigeon, a blue-barred hen named Augusta, wore camera number 3 mounted in its leather chest harness. Neubronner displayed the camera to the crowd, showing the loaded glass plate and pressurized air cylinder, then pulled the timer pin and released the bird at precisely 10 a.m. Augusta climbed rapidly, circling the glass palace twice before orienting toward Kronberg, 180 kilometers southeast. The pneumatic timer would trigger the shutter at 10:30, approximately 60 meters altitude. Neubronner had planned the demonstration with precision. Augusta would photograph the glass palace's distinctive iron and glass dome from directly above, creating an image impossible to fake from ground level. The crowd waited in theatrical silence. At 10:32 a.m., Augusta returned to Neubronner's mobile loft, landing with the camera still attached. Neubronner removed the camera, extracted the glass plate in his portable darkroom, and began development using Pyrogallol Developer at 18 degrees Celsius. Standard development time, 4 minutes. He'd practiced this sequence 200 times, refining it for public demonstration. At 10:41 a.m., he transferred the negative to a fixing bath. At 10:47 a.m., he placed the wet negative in an enlarger and projected the image onto a white screen visible to the entire crowd. The photograph showed the Glass Palace's dome from 67 meters altitude, captured at a slight angle revealing the building's cruciform floor plan. The iron framework appeared in sharp detail. Visitors visible on the entrance plaza were recognizable as human figures. The Elbe River curved through the background, with the Augustus Bridge identifiable by its distinctive arches. Total time from bird launch to displayed photograph, 47 minutes. The crowd's applause lasted 3 minutes. Neubronner performed 6 more demonstrations that week, each successful. Camera number 7, flown on May 6th, photographed Dresden's Zwinger Palace from 82 meters. Camera number 4, launched May 8th during a light rain, captured the Frauenkirche through broken clouds at 71 meters altitude. European photography journals that had dismissed Neubronner's work for 5 years suddenly reversed position. Photographische Rundschau published a formal retraction of their 1907 critique on May 15th. Ernst Abbe requested a private meeting to examine the lens design. Neubronner politely declined. The Dresden demonstrations attracted attention from unexpected quarters. On May 10th, 2 men in civilian clothes approached Neubronner after his morning flight, introducing themselves as technical observers from the Prussian War Ministry. They asked specific questions about flight range, payload capacity, and whether the cameras could be triggered at predetermined coordinates rather than fixed time delays. Neubronner answered honestly. Current technology allowed only time-based triggering, but altitude-sensing mechanisms were theoretically possible. The military observers took notes and disappeared. Captain Hermann von Tschudi arrived at Neubronner's Kronberg Pharmacy on June 23, 1909, carrying authorization from the Prussian General Staff to negotiate exclusive military development rights. Von Tschudi commanded the Aerial Reconnaissance Section, a newly formed intelligence unit tasked with evaluating emerging observation technologies. He'd witnessed Neubronner's Dresden demonstrations personally and immediately recognized tactical applications that civilian photographers had missed. Battlefield reconnaissance in 1909 relied on cavalry scouts and observation balloons, both vulnerable to enemy fire and limited in range. A pigeon carrying a camera could penetrate 30 kilometers behind enemy lines, photograph troop positions, and return within 2 hours. No existing technology offered comparable capability. The German Army purchased 100 Pigeon cameras between August 1909 and March 1914 at 75 marks per unit. Neubronner's loft became a military production facility, though he continued operating the pharmacy as civilian cover. Von Tschudi's requirements exceeded civilian specifications. Cameras needed weatherproofing for rain operations, reinforced housings to survive rough handling by field soldiers, and simplified loading procedures that didn't require jeweler's precision. Neubronner redesigned the aluminum body with overlapping seams sealed with beeswax, added a protective glass cover over the lens, and created a foolproof film loading cartridge that privates could manage in field conditions. French military intelligence learned of the German Pigeon camera program through an informant at the Dresden exhibition. By January 1911, the French Army had contracted with Paris-based camera manufacturer Établissement Géo to develop competing systems. The French approach emphasized standardization over miniaturization. Their cameras weighed 125 grams but used interchangeable film magazines, allowing multiple exposures per flight. Neither system saw significant pre-war deployment. European armies in 1912 considered aviation a novelty, useful for observation, but strategically irrelevant compared to artillery and infantry. World War I transformed that assessment within 6 weeks. The Battle of Tannenberg in August 1914 demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of inadequate reconnaissance. Russian armies advanced into East Prussia without accurate intelligence on German positions. German commanders, using aerial reconnaissance from primitive Taube aircraft and pigeon-mounted cameras, identified gaps in Russian coordination and executed a devastating encirclement. Approximately 50,000 Russian soldiers died. 92,000 were captured. Post-battle analysis credited German intelligence superiority as decisive. Pigeon cameras had photographed Russian artillery positions from altitudes and angles impossible for observation balloons, which Russian gunners targeted immediately. The Western Front created perfect conditions for pigeon camera operations. Trench warfare's static positions meant pigeons could be trained on specific routes over enemy trenches. German units deployed pigeon cameras extensively during the Race to the Sea in fall 1914, photographing French and British defensive preparations along a 700-kilometer front. Image quality remained poor. The single-element lenses Neubronner had designed for weight reduction struggled with atmospheric haze and low-contrast trenches. But the photographs revealed troop concentrations, artillery placements, and supply dumps invisible to ground observers. French forces employed pigeon cameras during the Verdun offensive in 1916, launching birds from forward positions to photograph German artillery positions in the Meuse Heights. One mission on March 8, 1916, produced photographs showing previously unknown German heavy guns emplaced in forest positions 4 kilometers behind the front lines. French counter-battery fire destroyed 3 of the 5 guns within 48 hours. The intelligence value was undeniable, but the operational constraints remained severe. Pigeons flew fixed routes determined by homing instinct, couldn't be redirected mid-flight, and required calm weather. Rain grounded the entire reconnaissance capability. By 1918, airplane reconnaissance had evolved sufficiently to render pigeon cameras obsolete. Aircraft carried professional photographers with plate cameras, could photograph on demand rather than predetermined routes, and returned with dozens of exposures instead of single images. The last documented military pigeon camera flight occurred in October 1918 near Cambrai. The fundamental limitation was navigational rigidity. Homing pigeons fly instinctively toward their loft using magnetic field sensing and visual landmarks, following routes they cannot alter mid-flight. A pigeon released 30 kilometers east of its home will fly west regardless of tactical requirements. This meant military planners couldn't redirect reconnaissance missions based on developing battlefield situations. If enemy forces unexpectedly shifted positions, the pigeon would photograph empty terrain, while critical targets remained unobserved. Aircraft reconnaissance, by contrast, allowed pilots to adjust flight paths in real time, circling important positions or investigating unexpected movements. Weather dependency proved equally crippling. Pigeons refuse to fly in rain heavier than light drizzle. The water saturates their feathers, increasing weight and reducing lift. They navigate poorly in fog, often landing prematurely when visibility drops below 500 meters. Wind speeds above 40 kilometers per hour exhaust them within 15 minutes, forcing emergency landings far from their destination. During the 1916 Somme offensive, British forces planned 73 pigeon camera reconnaissance missions over a 3-week period. Weather conditions permitted only 19 flights. Of those, 7 pigeons landed behind British lines due to navigation errors in overcast conditions. 4 were killed by German sharpshooters who'd learned to watch for birds carrying unusual chest loads, and 8 returned with usable photographs, a 43% success rate under ideal conditions. Aircraft reconnaissance evolved rapidly under wartime pressure. In 1914, pilots carried handheld cameras and photographed casually over the side of cockpits. By 1916, specialized reconnaissance aircraft like the British Fe-2 carried vertical cameras mounted in the fuselage floor, producing systematic photographic coverage of entire sectors. The German Rumpler CFs, introduced in 1917, carried telephoto cameras capable of photographing from 7,000 meters altitude, far beyond anti-aircraft range. These cameras used 18x 24 centimeter glass plates with compound lenses that resolved individual soldiers from 5 kilometers altitude. Neubronner's 444 centimeter plates captured from 60 meters looked primitive by comparison. Image quality limitations hurt Pigeon cameras severely. The single-element lenses produced acceptable sharpness in high-contrast situations, buildings against sky, ships against water, but rendered low-contrast subjects like trenches and camouflage positions as indistinct smudges. Professional military cameras by 1917 use 4-element anastigmat lenses corrected for chromatic and spherical aberration, producing images sharp enough for photo interpreters to identify individual weapon types. Pigeon camera photographs required extensive interpretation and provided minimal tactical detail beyond general position identification. Operational tempo exposed another weakness. Preparing a Pigeon camera for flight required 20-30 minutes. Load film plate in darkroom, pressurize air cylinder, calibrate timer, attach harness, and transport bird to launch point. An aircraft could launch within 5 minutes and photograph continuously for 90 minutes using magazine-fed cameras carrying 50-100 exposures. A single reconnaissance aircraft in 1918 could gather more photographic intelligence in one mission than 50 Pigeon cameras deployed across an entire day. The mathematical superiority was insurmountable. The strategic value equation shifted decisively by mid-1917. Early in the war, when aircraft were scarce and unreliable, Pigeon cameras filled a genuine intelligence gap. By 1918, major powers operated thousands of dedicated reconnaissance aircraft. The Royal Flying Corps alone deployed 1,782 reconnaissance aircraft on the Western Front by November 1918. Germany fielded approximately 4,400. These aircraft conducted 10,000, 15,000 reconnaissance missions monthly, producing millions of photographic images analyzed by specialized interpretation units. Pigeon cameras, expensive to maintain and limited in capability, offered no advantages that justified continued investment. The last Pigeon camera production run ended in March 1918. Neubronner received final payment from the German Army in May 1918, 3,200 marks for 42 cameras, delivered between January and March. He converted his workshop back to pharmaceutical use that summer. The Central Intelligence Agency's Office of Research and Development revived Pigeon camera technology in 1972, under project codename Tacana. The motivation wasn't nostalgia. It was Cold War operational necessity. Urban surveillance in Soviet bloc cities presented unique challenges that traditional reconnaissance methods couldn't solve. Satellite imagery from the Koach 9-hexagon system provided excellent coverage of military installations and industrial complexes, but couldn't penetrate urban areas where buildings obscured street-level activity. U-2 and SR-71 overflights risked international incidents for marginal intelligence gain. Human agents operating in Moscow, East Berlin, and Warsaw needed backup surveillance capabilities that didn't require risky personal presence. Carl Hart, an engineer in the CIA's Directional Finding and Surveillance Division, proposed adapting Neubronner's concept using 1970s miniaturization technology. Hart had studied World War I reconnaissance systems as part of his graduate work at MIT and recognized that solid-state electronics eliminated the weight constraints that had limited Pigeon cameras to single exposures. A modern camera using silicon photodiodes, integrated circuit timing chips, and miniature electric motors could weigh 35 grams and capture 40 sequential images on 16mm film. More importantly, modern training techniques allowed Pigeons to be directed towards specific urban targets rather than simply flying home. The CIA contracted with Eastman Kodak's Special Products Division to develop the camera system. Kodak's engineers, operating under security clearances, that prohibited them from knowing the intended platform, created a cylindrical camera body 4.8 centimeters long and 2.2 centimeters in diameter. The lens, a three-element design corrected for chromatic aberration, resolved objects 15 centimeters across from 80 meters altitude. The film advance mechanism used a spring wound motor that advanced film and triggered exposures every 3.2 seconds, controlled by a quartz crystal oscillator accurate to 0.001%. Total system weight, 38 grams including battery. Training pigeons for directed flight required behavioral conditioning techniques developed at Johns Hopkins University's Comparative Psychology Laboratory. Researchers discovered that pigeons could learn to recognize specific buildings as feeding sites, then reliably fly toward those sites when released several kilometers away. CIA trainers in 1974-1976 conditioned pigeons to target distinctive architecture in American cities that matched Soviet bloc urban patterns. Orthodox church domes, brutalist apartment blocks, industrial cooling towers. The birds learned to circle designated buildings 3 to 4 times before returning to their mobile lofts, providing sustained photographic coverage from multiple angles. Declassified CIA documents confirm at least 9 operational deployments of Tacana systems between 1976 and 1978, though specific target locations remain redacted. Mission reports describe satisfactory image acquisition and useful intelligence regarding pedestrian traffic patterns and vehicle staging areas. One partially declassified assessment from March 1977 notes that pigeon-mounted cameras successfully photographed a target building's roof access points and ventilation systems, intelligence crucial for planning a separate human penetration operation. The program ended in 1979. Not due to technical failure, but strategic obsolescence. Advances in miniature radio-controlled aircraft offered superior controllability and longer flight duration. The Lockheed Martin Akla drone, under development since 1975, could carry a 900-gram camera payload for 90 minutes while being actively directed by ground controllers. Pigeons, despite their biological advantages, silent operation, natural camouflage in urban environments, no electronic emissions, couldn't match the tactical flexibility of purpose-built unmanned vehicles. The CIA destroyed most Tacana hardware in 1980-1981, following standard equipment disposal protocols. 3 complete camera systems survived, transferred to the National Cryptologic Museum in Fort Meade, Maryland, where they remain in storage, still classified as restricted access items unavailable for public exhibition. The pigeons, of course, simply retired. Neubronner's miniaturization principles influenced camera design far beyond pigeon reconnaissance. His insight that photographic systems could sacrifice optical perfection for extreme weight reduction while still producing tactically useful images became foundational to spy camera development throughout the Cold War. The Minox subminiature camera, introduced in 1936 by Latvian engineer Walter Zopp, used an 8 or 11 mm film format and single-element lens design, directly descended from Neubronner's work. Zapp acknowledged studying Neubronner's patents while developing the Minox, particularly the curved aluminum housing technique that allowed structural strength at minimal weight. The Minox became standard equipment for intelligence operatives from the 1940s through the 1980s, with over 1.2 million units produced. The engineering philosophy extended into aerial reconnaissance platform design. Modern unmanned aerial vehicles follow the same mass optimization logic Neubronner applied in 1904. Identify the minimum viable payload, then design the lightest possible platform to carry it. The RQ-11 Raven, deployed by U.S. forces since 2003, weighs 1.9 kilograms, including a 90-gram camera system, a direct intellectual descendant of the Pigeon camera's weight-driven design constraints. Raven's engineers at AeroVironment studied historical miniaturization case studies during development, specifically citing Neubronner's work as demonstrating that successful aerial imaging prioritizes operational utility over theoretical image quality. Automatic triggering mechanisms trace their lineage to Neubronner's pneumatic timer. Before his invention, cameras required manual operation by a human photographer. The concept of autonomous image capture, a camera that decides when to expose film based on preset conditions, originated in that Kronberg workshop. Modern digital cameras use sophisticated algorithms to determine optimal exposure moments, but the underlying principle remains unchanged. Remove human decision-making from the photographic process. Drone reconnaissance systems today capture thousands of images automatically using GPS-triggered systems and altitude sensors, executing Neubronner's vision at electronic speed. The curved aluminum housing technique found applications in aerospace engineering. Aircraft skin panels, spacecraft heat shields, and satellite equipment housings all use compound curved aluminum formed through techniques derived from Neubronner's hand-hammering methods. The principle that curved structures provide superior strength-to-weight ratios compared to flat panels became formalized through finite element analysis in the 1960s. But Neubronner had discovered it empirically through workshop iterations 60 years earlier. Perhaps most significantly, Neubronner demonstrated that complex engineering problems could be solved through persistent empiricism rather than theoretical calculation. His competitors at Zeiss and other optical firms approached miniaturization mathematically, calculating theoretical performance limits and declaring Pigeon cameras impossible. Neubronner ignored the calculations and built prototypes until one worked. This methodology, rapid iteration, empirical testing, acceptance of imperfect solutions that satisfy operational requirements, became standard practice in aerospace development. Kelly Johnson's Skunk Works division at Lockheed, responsible for the U-2 and SR-71 reconnaissance aircraft, operated on identical principles: build it, test it, fix what breaks, ignore theoretical objections. Neubronner died in Kronberg on April 19, 1932, age 67, still operating his pharmacy. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his pharmaceutical career and civic contributions, but made no reference to Pigeon cameras. The technology he'd invented had been obsolete for 14 years, forgotten except by military historians studying World War I reconnaissance. His workshop remained intact until 1944, when Allied bombing destroyed the building. The contents, including prototype cameras, glass plate negatives, and engineering notebooks, were lost. 3 surviving cameras reside in the Deutsches Museum in Munich, displayed in a cabinet devoted to early aviation technology. The placard identifies them as curiosities of early aerial photography, without mentioning the 40,200 marks spent, the 18 months of failed prototypes, or the satisfaction of proving the Imperial Patent Office wrong.